In the end, we don't regret the things we did in life nearly as much as the things we never did. The older I get, the more I understand that. My father lived until I was 40 years old, and yet somehow in all of those years, I never asked the questions that matter most. Not really. I knew him as my father, the steady presence in my life, the man with stories that surfaced now and then around the dinner table or during long drives. Stories about growing up in old mining towns of the American West, about music, hardship, war, adventure, loss. But when he told these stories, I was young, distracted, consumed with building my own life. I never stopped to realize that one day the storyteller would be gone, and with him, entire worlds. Worlds I can now only piece together through fading photographs, newspaper clippings, official records, scattered memories, and the fragments of stories he left behind. The deeper I've gone into my family history, the more I've realized this journey is about far more than names and dates. It's about understanding who these people truly were, what shaped them, what wounded them, what gave them joy, and how the lives they lived quietly shaped my own. These are the stories of those early years, pieced together from memory, research, and the echoes my father left behind. And in many ways, this is my attempt to finally ask the questions I never asked when he was still here to answer them. Globe, Arizona in 1920 was still very much a frontier mining town. Hard, dusty, a place shaped by copper, ambition, and survival. Men came there chasing fortunes beneath the earth. Most found only hard work. But for the families who built lives there, Globe was more than a mining camp. It was home. My grandfather, Dr. John Delaney Holcomb, arrived in Globe in 1905, fresh out of dental college at the University of Southern California. Young, educated, and ambitious, he quickly established himself as a respected dentist and community figure in a town filled with miners, merchants, and working families trying to carve stability out of an unforgiving landscape. My grandmother, Eudora Weisbecker, had come to Arizona years earlier as a young girl after her own father found work in the copper mines of Globe and nearby Copper Hill. Like so many families drawn west in those years, theirs had come searching for opportunity in a place where life was never easy and tomorrow was never guaranteed. By the time my father was born in 1920, both of his parents had already known deep loss. Each had buried a spouse far too young. My grandfather's first wife had died from cancer. My grandmother's first husband had been taken by the Spanish flu, part of the terrible pandemic that swept through the world only a few years earlier. And so, when they married, they were not simply beginning a new life together, they were trying to rebuild lives that had already been broken once before. My grandfather brought a daughter, Helen, into the marriage. My grandmother brought her daughter, Beverly, and together they formed a blended family bound as much by grief as by hope. People learning how to begin again in the shadow of loss. 4 years later came his sister, Doris May, and for a brief stretch of time, life may have finally seemed steady, perhaps even hopeful. A growing family, a respected profession, a future beginning to take shape beneath the Arizona sun. But by early 1925, when Dad was not yet 5 years old, the family made a decision that would change the course of their lives. They left Globe behind and headed west to Los Angeles, where Grandpa opened a new dental practice. No one knows all of the reasons for the move, but most of Grandpa's family lived in the Los Angeles area, so family ties almost certainly played a part. Los Angeles was where Grandpa had attended dental school 25 years earlier, and it was a city growing faster than almost anyone could imagine. a place of electric streetcars, oil wealth, orange groves, and expanding neighborhoods. Compared to Globe, it must have felt like stepping into the future itself. And then, in 1929, the country changed. Almost overnight, the optimism of the 1920s gave way to fear. The stock market crashed that October, sending shockwaves throughout the nation. Banks failed, businesses disappeared. Men who had once felt secure suddenly found themselves standing in unemployment lines, wondering how they would feed their families. Across America, the illusion of stability began to crumble. The Great Depression would cripple the nation for the next 10 years. In Los Angeles, life likely grew harder for the Holcomb family as well. We do not know exactly what pressures built inside that household during those years. Financial strain, emotional stress, the weight of expectations. Whatever the causes, something had clearly begun to fracture beneath the surface. By September of 1931, Dad's parents were no longer living together. Grandma Dora had moved to Huntington Beach, staying with her sister Vivian and Vivian's husband, John Richards. Perhaps everyone believed the separation would only be temporary. Perhaps they were simply trying to create distance and give emotions time to settle. But for an 11-year-old boy, it must have felt like the ground beneath his life was slowly shifting. And then, without warning, everything changed. In October of 1931, Dad's father came to visit. By all appearances, the evening passed normally. He stayed the night. But sometime the next day, as he was driving back towards Los Angeles, something inside him gave way. When the car stopped and Grandma stepped outside, Grandpa pulled a revolver and shot her. When John Richards tried to intervene, he was shot as well. And then, in the terrible silence that followed, Grandpa took his own life by swallowing cyanide. Grandma survived. John Richards did not. For my father, just 11 years old at the time, it is almost impossible to imagine the shock of what followed. Childhood has a way of ending suddenly for some people. One moment the world feels safe and familiar, and the next it will never be again. The tragedy did not simply interrupt his childhood, it divided his life into before and after. And afterward, there was little choice but to keep moving forward. Grandma Dora gathered the children and left Southern California behind. They traveled north to Melones, a small gold mining town tucked into the Sierra foothills, where her parents, Adolf and Karen Weisbecker, still lived. Her sister Vivian came too, now a widow herself, raising 3 young boys. And just like that, a new household formed out of shared grief and necessity. 2 sisters, several children, aging parents, all gathered beneath one roof in a fading mining town that had already seen its own share of hardship. It was not the life any of them had imagined. But during the darkest years of the Great Depression, families often survived the only way they could, by holding tightly to one another after everything else had fallen apart. At the center of my father's world was his grandfather, Adolf Weisbecker, who had assumed a sort of fatherly role and who was affectionately referred to as Pops. Pops was the master mechanic at Carson Hill Gold Mine, responsible for keeping the machinery alive and running. In a mining town, that was no small responsibility. The mine depended on engines, compressors, hoists, pumps, and mills that never seemed to stop moving. When something broke, Pops was the man expected to fix it. To a young boy, he must have seemed capable of almost anything. For Dad, those years in Melones were simple in some ways, but deeply formative in others. He attended the town's one-room schoolhouse, where children of every age learned together beneath the same roof. There were no luxuries there, just wooden desks, chalkboards, strict teachers, and lessons shaped as much by discipline as education. Dad completed the 8th grade there in 1933, surrounded by cousins, neighbors, and children whose families all carried the weight of Depression-era life in one form or another. But despite the hardships, he was rarely alone. The house was full. Siblings, cousins, grandparents, widows, and children, a family assembled not by design, but by necessity and survival. And somehow, with all of that loss and uncertainty, life continued. Laughter continued. Music continued. Among all the cousins and siblings, one person seemed especially close to Dad, his cousin Maury. The two boys shared more than family ties. They shared music. What may have begun simply as something to do gradually became something much larger. By the early 1930s, the boys were performing with the Angels Camp Band, playing at local dances, celebrations, parades, and community gatherings scattered throughout the foothill towns. During the darkest years of the Great Depression, those evenings must have felt like brief moments of escape, a few hours where people could forget unpaid bills, hard work, and uncertain futures. But through every transition, music remained. In May of 1935, more than 100 residents from Angels Camp traveled to Sacramento to celebrate the region's famous frog jumping tradition, inspired by the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, a novel by Mark Twain. It was part parade, part spectacle, part small-town pride, a colorful collision of brass bands, local characters, and California folklore. Governor Frank Merriam attended the festivities. And there, somewhere in the middle of the noise and excitement, stood my father, trombone in hand, playing with the Angels Camp Miners Band. By 1934, life shifted once again. Dad and Grandma Dora moved to Stockton, where he began high school and slowly stepped toward adulthood. Like many teenagers during those years, Dad worked while attending school, delivering newspapers for the Stockton Evening and Sunday Record. It was the kind of job countless young men took during the Depression, not glamorous, but necessary. Responsibility came early to that generation. By the mid-1930s, music had begun opening still larger doors. Dad joined Norval Wyrick's Collegiate Orchestra, a polished young dance band performing across California during the golden age of big band music. They played in hotel ballrooms, beach resorts, dance halls, and social clubs from Stockton to Santa Cruz to San Jose. Their sound was smooth, modern, and optimistic, the kind of music people turned to during hard times, because for a few hours at least, it made the world feel lighter. The band performed at places like the Casa del Rey Hotel and appeared on radio station KQW. On New Year's Eve at the Hotel Stockton, they headlined one of the city's major celebrations. And somewhere inside that orchestra, beneath the bright lights, cigarette smoke, and crowded dance floors, was my father's trombone cutting through the music. But life rarely stands still for long. In June of 1938, Dad left Melones behind and enlisted in the United States Navy, beginning what would become a 30-year military career. Even then, loss never drifted far from the family. In 1942, his grandmother, Karen Weisbecker, passed away at just 64 years old. 2 years later, Pops, Adolf Weisbecker, followed at 65. By then, Dad had already lived through more uncertainty and loss than many people experience in an entire lifetime. He had watched families change and rebuild themselves. He had learned at a very young age how quickly life could turn in unexpected directions. But he had also discovered something equally important: the strength people find in one another during those difficult times. And as he always said, everything will work out.